So now we're on to stomach and hunger. So one of these nervous systems stops kind of your hunger and digestion, and the other one starts your hunger and digestion. What do you think? Which? Well, you don't need to be hungry if you're gonna get eaten. So that would be like from caveman days, that's where your stress would come from, is from fighting someone else or running from a predator or something like that. So this would turn off your hunger, your digestion, because all the energy would be going towards helping you to get away from your danger. So your hunger comes back when you are kind of out of danger. So I don't know if any of you exercise heavily, like if you're running for long periods of time or playing a basketball game or doing some kind of sports activity. Rarely do you get hungry while you're in the activity. You tend to get hungry, like even taking a test. Like let's say that you're very hungry before a class and you go in and take the test. Your hunger won't kick in until the stress is past. So this starts your hunger on digestion, and this will stop your hunger. I'm sorry, my fault. This one stops your hunger and digestion, and this one starts your hunger and digestion. So the psychophysiological illness that's associated with the stomach is like ulcers, upset stomach, acid reflux. But you know what? Some of you might have been like, well, wait a second, Amy. You know what? I tend to eat more when I'm under stress. Now, here's something that I want to talk to you about is I think I know what you eat when you're stressed. And also, I want you to know that you're not alone. I think most of us, many of us, tend to eat differently when we're under stress. Some people stop eating altogether, and then other people, they just tend to want to eat certain things. So let me say this stuff that you crave. You probably crave high sugar things, and the reason is because your body needs a lot of sugar, a lot of quick, fast energy to get away from the danger. It craves like high calorie stuff. It craves carbohydrates because this is what gives us energy to get through a stressful situation. I doubt that you're craving salads. I doubt that you would even be craving a steak or something. You probably want, when you're stressed out, you probably want heavy food like pizza, maybe pasta, some bread, some cakes, chocolate, maybe. So again, there's reasons why you're craving it. Another thing is there's certain foods you make different neurotransmitters. So, for example, when we feel a little depressed or something is triggered, like kind of low emotional state, a lot of times we crave foods that tend to make serotonin. So, for example, carbohydrates tend to boost your serotonin levels. And then, did you know that sugar actually releases endorphins, which is the body's natural painkiller? And did you know that emotional pain is registered in the same place as physical pain? So, when we're going through emotional pain, we may crave the sugar as a way to release the natural painkiller that's within us, the endorphins. So, one thing is if you seem to have a problem with that, I know it's easier said than done. You could just ask yourself, am I hungry, or am I just eating this because I'm craving stimulation? So a lot of us eat when we're bored to release dopamine. But I think that when you're truly stressed, you don't actually feel hungry. You might crave food for other reasons, but you don't actually feel hungry because the sympathetic nervous system, it stops your hunger and your digestion. Okay. Let's go on to, we're going to do 2 on this slide. We're going to do the stomach and hunger, and then we're going to do urination and defecation. So what do you think? Does the sympathetic nervous system start the bladder or stop the bladder? So what I mean start the bladder is actually it constricts it, makes it poised to release the fluid. Whereas when it relaxes the bladder, it makes more room in the bladder. It's not poised to release the fluid. It can hold a lot of liquid. So does the sympathetic make you want to urinate, or does it stop the urination? What do you think? Okay, so when I teach this in a regular class, then basically I get about a 50-50 response. About half the class says the sympathetic makes you want to urinate, and then the other half of the class says no, it stops the urge to urinate. So the true response, the response that would be correct is the sympathetic nervous system seems to stop your urge to urinate and defecate. It relaxes the bladder, relaxes the bowels. Um, and then when everything's passed, we need to urinate. So, for example, those of you that take Speech 101, I doubt any of you had to go to the bathroom right in the middle of the speech. You probably had to urinate multiple times before you did the speech. Isn't that funny how that works? That when you get nervous, the brain seems to predict your nervousness. And what it does is it makes you try to empty the bladder so that it can hold it for long periods of time. But while you were on doing the speech, you probably didn't feel any urge at all to urinate. So this is what happens. Now, some of you say, "Oh yeah, well, what about that? I've heard of somebody urinating on themselves because they were so scared, or they defecated on themselves because they were so scared." And this is what I want to talk to you about next. I want to talk to you about these two concepts: fainting when you're scared, or urinating when you're scared. So, some of you have heard of cases like that where someone was so scared that they fainted, or they defecated or urinated on themselves. And what's going on with that is this thing up here called parasympathetic overcompensation. So, what happens is I told you to try to imagine that a rubber band holding your two index fingers apart. So the sympathetic nervous system gets stimulated, and your parasympathetic will pull back as a way to try to balance it out. So what happens when you get so scared that you faint, or so scared that you urinate on yourself, is what happened is the sympathetic nervous system pulled really hard and really fast, and then the parasympathetic was trying to compensate, trying to hold its grip on you, but it pulled back too far. So it was such a quick start that it pulled back too far. So for example, you faint because you saw something very scary, and then what it does is it collapses the lung. You don't get enough oxygen to the brain, and you fall out of consciousness. What happens when you urinate on yourself when you're so scared is you got so scared that the sympathetic got triggered, that parasympathetic pulled back too far, and it released the urine instead of withholding it. Now, this is a pretty cool concept. The concept of voodoo death. So, how many of you believe in voodoo death? Typically in a class, what I see, a class of 40, usually about only 2 people. But guess what? It is a very widely recognized phenomenon in psychology. But there's 2 criteria in order for it to work. And I think once I told you these 2 criteria, you'll agree with me. Oh, okay, yeah, we agree with that. So the first criteria for voodoo death. So for those of you that don't know what voodoo death is voodoo death is kind of, I put a spell on you, or I put a curse on you, or I say something to you, and then you fall ill, or you die, something like that. Okay, voodoo, it's like a death that's caused maybe by psychological factors like psychophysiological illness. So the 2 criteria that must be in place is the person must believe it, and their social support network must believe it. But a lot of you might be thinking right now, oh, but this is something that would only happen like in uneducated societies. But I think it happens in very educated societies too. And I'll give you an example. So I like to tell lots of stories about voodoo death, so I'll just tell you a couple. So here, let's do this one. So this was one. So where I'm getting this information from is a famous book by a pretty famous neuroscientist called, his name was Walter Cannon, and he published a bunch of stories all in his book. It was 1942, and he published a bunch of Voodoo Death stories. And he was kind of like a forerunner of neuroscience. So, for example, there was a missionary and he lived over in Africa and he would go preach from tribe to tribe. So, one time he came to this tribe. Well, his tribe, what he was preaching, believed that the hen, a chicken, was sacred. And when he came to another tribe, he asked, and the wisest man said, "Oh, here, I'll come and listen to what you have to say." He listened to that and he says, "Well, I don't agree with your beliefs and all, but if you want to stay for dinner, you can stay for dinner." He says, "Well, there's no hen in dinner, right?" And he says, "No, no, no, it's just some stew." So he eats the stew and then he goes along on his missionary way for 3 months. And then he comes back along the same path and, wants to stop in and see the guy again and tell him thank you for the dinner. And the guy says, "Oh, you're welcome. And by the way, how are you feeling?" And he says, "I'm feeling fine." "Well, you know that stew, it had hen in it. Do you see that nothing happened? Do you see that your religion is wrong?" And the guy started to feel sick right there, like, oh my gosh. And all he could do was he thought about it on his way home. And then he went back and he told his tribe, and his stomach just felt nauseous all the time. And they would pray over him, pray over him. And within 4 or 5 days, he had died. So this is the power of the mind. This had passed 3 months ago. There's no way that it could happen. This had to be the power of the mind, which is what a lot of stress is. A lot of stress is, what do you believe? Do you believe that this is good? Do you believe that this is bad? I could tell you a lot more stories, but I feel like sometimes online, um, maybe my lectures, since you don't get to see my face, the stories, so on and so forth, maybe the stories aren't as good. But I do feel like I need to show you a little bit more about this parasympathetic overcompensation and how it relates to voodoo death. So I'm going to show you with rats. So I could tell you a lot more ghost stories, believe me, I can, about this voodoo death thing. But let's do the rat one. So there was this guy, and his name was Richter. And he was in a lab, and he was pretty bored one day. And I don't know if you guys have ever done this. I could see somebody doing this just out of boredom. Is the rat was running around his table. He was working with the rats, and he had some scissors there. And he cut the whiskers. Now, when you cut a rat's whiskers, it's like cutting our fingernails. It doesn't hurt. But the difference between the rat's whiskers and our fingernails is the rat's whiskers have this thing in it called the vestibular sense. And so it kind of tells them where their head is in space. It has a lot to do with their touch sensations, even though there's no pain receptors in it. Just like our brain, there's no pain receptors in it. You can literally cut into the brain and it doesn't have any feelings. You can cut your fingernails and they don't have any feelings. So he cut the rat's whiskers, which kind of discombobulates him. And then he was testing rats' swimming abilities. They do that with rats' mazes and swimming and memory and so on and so forth. So he threw him in the water after cutting his whiskers. And he expected the rat to kind of be discombobulated swimmer. Like, just how is he going to run this maze? I know, he must have been really bored. A lot of time on his hands. But instead of the rat being discombobulated, he sank to the bottom. Sank to the bottom. As dead as a doornail. Now, for those of you that don't know, drowning takes a while. It doesn't happen super fast. You're not going to just sink to the ground and drown like that. And rats can swim really well. So he's like, what? What happened here? What? Have I discovered something new, that the whiskers are imperative for swimming? So he gets another one, chop chop. And another one does the same thing. What? Oh my gosh, this is terrible. He opens up the chest cavity, sees, no, it's not filled with water. The rat did not drown. So he gets another one, chop chop, throws it in the water, but this time he grabs him before he sinks to the bottom. And he feels his heart just pounding. You know how you can feel the heart pounding on, when you hold your animal. You can feel their heartbeat, right? It was like, oh my gosh. And you start stroking the rat, stroking the rat. Remember touch, how soothing touch is. Why is massage so important? Why is hugging people important, right? And he calms the rat. And after the rat calms down, because he can feel the heartbeat, he moves his hand and the rat swims. So what had happened to the first two rats was this parasympathetic overcompensation. Is, look, the rat, you just cut my whiskers, then you threw me in the water. That is so much sympathetic activation. So then the parasympathetic pulled back and he just died instantly, just shut down his heart. So they say that mentally we can have a will to live or a will to die. So there's a really famous psychologist that, if those of you who have some extra time and you want to read a really great book, it's a classic. It's called Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. And what happened to him is he was a psychiatrist, and he got thrown in the concentration camps for being Jewish. And he was in the concentration camps, and he was a prisoner there, but he did what came naturally to him, as he started to wonder about behavior. That's what psychology is, after all, right? So he wondered, why is it that some people seem to die so quickly and others don't, when we're all eating the same amount of calories, we're all under the same harsh conditions, we're all subjected to the same illnesses? And why is it that some of us become suicidal and some of us don't? And so he managed to get out of the concentration camp after spending time there. But basically, what he understood was that the people that still had something left to do were likely to survive if they believed that they might still have family alive, or if they still had a book to write, or if they still had a scientific project that they needed to finish. Then they would live against all odds. But the ones that thought all their family had died, or they just felt like there's nothing left for me to do, then they would die. Do you guys know the pretty famous statistic that says that's this is you've got two spouses that have been married for years and years, like 38 years or something like that. Then one spouse dies. What is the likelihood? What is the life expectancy of the second spouse? Do you guys know? It's 2 years. That's a pretty well documented medical finding, that you have a 2-year life expectancy. But the people that beat that, what do you think they have? What they have is they have something left to live for, like they have children to still take care of, or grandchildren to take care of, or they have a career that they're really invested in, or they have a lot of social connections to kind of replace the one that was lost. So with this parasympathetic overcompensation, I hope that we can see like how mental stress is, and how it can really, our beliefs about something can really influence our health. So our next module is going to be a great video called How to Make Stress Your Friend.